Robert Gabriel Mugabe was born on the 21st of February in the year 1924 in Kudama, a small village located in the Zimbabwe district of what was then Southern Rhodesia, a British colony in southern Africa. He was born into the Shona ethnic group, one of the major groups of the country. His father Gabriel Matibarai worked as a carpenter, while his mother Bona taught at a Catholic mission. Robert grew up in a deeply religious household, raised with Catholic teachings and strict discipline. His family valued education highly, and Robert excelled in his studies from an early age. His childhood was marked by both poverty and the heavy presence of colonial rule, where white settlers controlled most of the land, wealth, and political power, while the African majority lived under racial discrimination and harsh restrictions. When Robert was still a young boy, his father abandoned the family after losing his job, leaving his mother to care for the children alone. This event left a strong impact on him, and his mother struggled to support the family. Despite these challenges, Robert Mugabe distinguished himself academically. He attended mission schools run by Jesuits, where he was taught by Father Jerome Ohi, a strict but influential priest who recognized his intellectual ability. Ohi encouraged him to pursue higher education and instilled in him the belief that knowledge could empower Africans to challenge colonial oppression. In 1941 Mugabe was admitted to Kudama College, a Catholic institution, and in 1945 he graduated as a teacher. Over the next few years, he worked as a schoolteacher in various mission schools while continuing to pursue his studies. During this time he began to read widely, immersing himself in works of Marxism, nationalism, and African liberation. He admired leaders such as Mahatma Gandhi and Kwame Nkrumah, and he became convinced that the struggle for African independence was not only political but also intellectual. In 1950s Southern Rhodesia, racial inequality was severe. The land was dominated by a white minority who owned the fertile farms, while Africans were confined to poor rural reserves. Africans were denied political representation and faced restrictions on movement and employment. These injustices shaped Mugabe's political consciousness. In 1955 he moved to South Africa to study at the University of Fort Hare, one of the few institutions in Africa where black students could receive higher education. Fort Hare was a hub of African nationalist thought, and Mugabe interacted with future leaders from across the continent. He graduated with a Bachelor of Arts degree in History and English in 1951. Afterward he continued to pursue education while teaching in northern Rhodesia, later Zambia, and in Ghana. In Ghana, Mugabe was exposed to Pan-African ideas and the successes of Kwame Nkrumah, who had led Ghana to independence in 1957. Mugabe married Sally Hayfron, a Ghanaian teacher, in 1961. Sally would become an important partner and moral support during his early political struggles. The couple shared a vision of African liberation and social justice. Mugabe returned to southern Rhodesia in 1960, a time of rising nationalist movements. The National Democratic Party had been formed to demand independence and majority rule, but it was soon banned by the colonial authorities. Mugabe quickly rose as a skilled orator and intellectual within the movement. He became Secretary General of the newly formed Zimbabwe African National Union, known as ZANU, in 1963. ZANU advocated armed struggle against the colonial government, believing that peaceful negotiation would not end white minority rule. In 1964 Mugabe was arrested by the Rhodesian authorities under Prime Minister Ian Smith, who represented the white minority regime. He was imprisoned for 10 years, from 1964 until 1974, in harsh conditions. During his imprisonment Mugabe continued to study. He earned multiple university degrees through correspondence courses, including economics, law, and education. He became known as a man of great discipline, intelligence, and determination. His years in prison transformed him into a respected leader among African nationalists. In 1974 Mugabe was released, and he immediately took leadership of the armed struggle against the Rhodesian regime. ZANU's military wing, ZANLA, carried out guerrilla warfare from bases in Mozambique, targeting Rhodesian forces and infrastructure. The conflict became known as the Rhodesian Bush War, a bloody and prolonged struggle between nationalist guerrillas and the Rhodesian security forces. Mugabe emerged as a central figure, both feared and admired, for his uncompromising stance on majority rule. The war intensified throughout the 1970s, and the Rhodesian economy began to suffer under international sanctions and internal conflict. The Smith government declared unilateral independence from Britain in 1965, but it was not recognized internationally. By the late 1970s it became clear that white minority rule could not survive. Pressure from Britain, the United States, and neighboring African states led to negotiations. In 1979 the Lancaster House Agreement was signed in London, bringing an end to the war. The agreement established a ceasefire and paved the way for democratic elections under British supervision. The new nation would be called Zimbabwe, after the ancient stone ruins of Great Zimbabwe, symbolizing African heritage. In the elections of 1980 Robert Mugabe and ZANU won a decisive victory, gaining the majority of parliamentary seats. On April 18, 1980, Zimbabwe officially became independent, and Robert Mugabe was sworn in as the first prime minister of the country. For many Africans, both within Zimbabwe and across the continent, this was a moment of triumph. Mugabe, who had spent years in prison and war, was celebrated as a liberation hero. His speeches promised reconciliation between blacks and whites, land reform to restore justice, and development to uplift the poor majority. Even many white farmers and businessmen were reassured by his initial calls for peace and cooperation. In the early years of independence, Mugabe's government focused on education, healthcare, and infrastructure. Schools were built across the country, and literacy rates rose rapidly. Health clinics expanded access to medical services, and child mortality rates fell. Zimbabwe became a model in Africa for social development. Mugabe's policies earned him international recognition and admiration. Western governments, which had once criticized him as a radical, now offered aid and partnerships. Yet beneath the surface, challenges remained. The promise of land reform was slow to materialize. The best farmland remained in the hands of white farmers, while the African majority waited for redistribution. Ethnic tensions also simmered between the Shona majority, which Mugabe represented, and the Ndeb minority, whose leaders had supported ZAPU, a rival nationalist movement led by Joshua Komu. The uneasy coalition between ZANU and ZAPU began to unravel. By the mid-1980s political rivalry turned violent, and the government launched a brutal campaign in the Matabeleland region known as Gukarayandi. The Gukarayandi campaign in the Matabeleland region began in 1983, just 3 years after independence. Mugabe, leading a government dominated by his ZANU party, viewed the opposition ZAPU led by Joshua Komu as a threat to national unity and to his authority. He deployed the 5th Brigade, an elite military unit trained by North Koreans, to suppress alleged dissidents in Matabeleland. The campaign quickly turned into a massacre of civilians. Villages were raided, thousands of men, women, and children were executed, and many more suffered torture and displacement. Estimates suggest that between 10,000 and 20,000 people were killed during this period. Mugabe described the campaign as necessary to quell rebellion, but for the Ndeb people it became a symbol of repression and ethnic persecution. The brutality of Gukuraindi left deep scars on Zimbabwean society and remains one of the darkest chapters of Mugabe's rule. By 1987 the conflict between ZANU and ZAPU ended when Joshua Komu was pressured into a unity agreement. ZAPU merged with ZANU, forming the Zimbabwe African National Union Patriotic Front, or ZANU-PF, which became the dominant political force. That same year, constitutional changes abolished the post of Prime Minister, and Mugabe assumed the new position of executive president with wide powers. From this point, his control over Zimbabwe grew stronger. The unity agreement ended open political conflict at the top, but it cemented Mugabe's hold on the state. In the late 1980s and early 1990s Mugabe continued to present himself as a champion of education and development. Zimbabwe's literacy rate became one of the highest in Africa, and many foreign observers praised the country for its achievements in schooling and health care. However, the economy faced challenges. Corruption spread within the ruling party, and state enterprises became inefficient. The government borrowed heavily, and structural adjustment programs imposed by the International Monetary Fund in the 1990s demanded cuts in social spending, leading to rising poverty and discontent among the population. Mugabe's government also faced growing pressure over land reform. At independence, white farmers still controlled large portions of the best farmland. While Mugabe had promised redistribution, he initially pursued a policy of willing buyer and willing seller, where land would be transferred only if white owners agreed to sell and funds were available to compensate them. Progress was slow, and by the late 1990s frustration among landless black peasants grew. Veterans of the Liberation War, who had supported Mugabe with the expectation of land, became restless. In 2000, after losing a constitutional referendum that would have increased his powers, Mugabe launched a radical land redistribution program. Groups of war veterans and ZANU-PF supporters began invading white-owned farms, often violently, forcing farmers off their land. The government supported these seizures, and soon the majority of white farmers were expelled. Mugabe justified the policy as correcting colonial injustices and empowering black Zimbabweans. Many in Africa praised him for standing up to Western interests, but the land reform was chaotic and destructive. Experienced farmers were driven out, agricultural production collapsed, and the economy spiraled downward. The once productive farms that had made Zimbabwe a major exporter of food were left in decline. Shortages of maize, wheat, and other staples appeared, and famine threatened rural populations. Inflation rose rapidly, unemployment increased, and foreign investment fled. Western countries imposed sanctions, further isolating Zimbabwe. Mugabe responded by tightening his grip on power, blaming foreign governments and internal opponents for the crisis. The opposition party Movement for Democratic Change, or MDC, led by Morgan Tsvangirai, gained popularity as people sought alternatives. Elections in the 2000s were marked by violence, intimidation, and accusations of fraud. Opposition supporters were harassed, beaten, and sometimes killed. The press was restricted, and Mugabe used state institutions to maintain control. Despite this, the MDC made significant gains, challenging ZANU-PF's dominance. In the 2008 presidential election, Morgan Tsvangirai won more votes than Mugabe in the first round, but not enough to avoid a runoff. The runoff campaign turned into a wave of terror, with opposition members targeted across the country. Tsvangirai withdrew, and Mugabe declared victory. International observers condemned the process, but Mugabe remained in office. By this time, Zimbabwe's economy had collapsed almost completely. Hyperinflation reached unimaginable levels, with prices doubling daily. In 2008 inflation was measured in billions of percent, and the government printed trillion-dollar banknotes that became worthless. Shops were empty, and millions of Zimbabweans fled the country, seeking refuge in South Africa, Botswana, and other nations. Life expectancy fell dramatically, and diseases spread as hospitals lacked supplies. The dream of prosperity that Mugabe had promised in 1980 had turned into despair for millions. In 2009 a power-sharing agreement was forced after intense international pressure. Mugabe remained president, but Morgan Tsvangirai became prime minister in a unity government. The arrangement stabilized the economy temporarily by abandoning the Zimbabwean dollar and adopting foreign currencies such as the US dollar and South African rand. Some growth returned, and living conditions improved slightly, but Mugabe never gave up real control. He used the period to reassert ZANU-PF's dominance, and by 2013 he had maneuvered his way back to full authority after winning another disputed election. Despite the suffering in the country, Mugabe remained defiant. He presented himself as a Pan-African hero resisting Western imperialism. Many African leaders admired his rhetoric and his history as a liberation fighter. Internationally he remained a controversial figure, celebrated in some circles as a revolutionary but condemned widely for his repression and economic mismanagement. As he grew older, questions about succession became more pressing. His first wife Sally had died in 1992, and in 1996 he married Grace Marafua, who was decades younger. Grace Mugabe became increasingly influential, building her own faction within ZANU-PF and positioning herself as a possible successor. This caused deep divisions within the ruling party, especially with military leaders who opposed her rise. By 2017 Mugabe was 93 years old, and his health was failing. Yet he insisted on running for another term. His attempt to elevate Grace triggered resistance from the army and longtime allies. In November 2017 the military launched a takeover, insisting it was not a coup but a move to restore stability. Tanks rolled into Harare, and Mugabe was placed under house arrest. Negotiations followed, but Mugabe refused to resign. Eventually, as Parliament prepared to impeach him, he stepped down on the 21st of November 2017, ending 37 years in power. The news was met with celebrations across Zimbabwe. Crowds filled the streets, cheering the end of a long era. For many citizens, Mugabe's resignation symbolized the end of decades of repression and hardship. His former ally Emmerson Mnangagwa, backed by the military, took over as president. Mugabe withdrew from public life, living quietly with his family. Robert Mugabe died on the 6th of September 2019 in Singapore at the age of 95. His death marked the end of one of the most remarkable and controversial political careers in Africa. He was remembered by some as a liberation hero who fought bravely against colonial rule and brought education and dignity to black Zimbabweans. Others remembered him as a tyrant whose later years in power were marked by violence, corruption, and economic collapse that left his country impoverished. The legacy of Robert Mugabe remains divided. He embodied the hopes of African independence in the 1980s and the tragedies of authoritarian rule in later decades. His life traced the path from teacher to revolutionary, from prisoner to president, from celebrated liberator to reviled dictator. He shaped Zimbabwe's destiny for nearly 4 decades, leaving behind both achievements in education and healthcare and scars from repression, massacres, and economic ruin. The story of Mugabe is not only about one man but about the struggles of an entire nation navigating the challenges of colonialism, liberation, and governance in the modern era.